So we are recording. I'm going to start us off with the quickest presentation ever, hopefully. And I'm going to put it in presentation mode. Oh no. Can you see it in presentation mode? No. Okay. Hang on.
I can see it.
Oh,
It's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. Let me try one more time. Wait a minute. Sorry, y'all. Okay. How does it look now?
That's better.
Okay. All right. So welcome again. Hi, I'm Claire Cambardella. I work for University of Maryland Sea Grant Extension, and I am here tonight to talk to you quickly about what conservation landscaping is. So I work for Sea Grant Extension, which means that my focus is actually on water quality, but it turns out that what goes on the land has the biggest impact on our water quality. So without further ado, at least I think, there we go. So this is just a quick note from the university to let everyone know that we are an equal opportunity provider and our programs are open to everyone. So as a Sea Grant Extension watershed restoration specialist, my focus is actually on the Chesapeake Bay. And why the Chesapeake Bay? I like to usually give everybody a couple minutes to think about, why you might be interested in improving the health of your local rivers and streams, or some experience that you've had outside having to do with water. But I can just lay it out really quickly here. I think we all know on some level that the Chesapeake Bay and our major rivers, especially that flow into the bay, have a major economic and recreational value. So some people like to go boating. Some people actually catch crabs and oysters that live in the bay. They sell those types of seafood to restaurants that, Maryland is known for our crab cakes. So it's really an icon. But the thing is, we hear a lot about, cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. The thing is that to clean up the bay, we have to start upstream in our local waterways. So I focus on Baltimore County, Baltimore City. I actually work in Harford County and Carroll County as well. And the majority of those areas is not a coastline that has to do, that's right on the Chesapeake Bay, right? So there's this huge area that drains, a huge area of land that drains into the Chesapeake Bay. It starts all the way up in the state of New York with the Susquehanna River. Starts up here and then flows down through Pennsylvania into Maryland and then becomes the bay that it flows through Virginia and then out into the Atlantic Ocean. So there's also a little piece of Delaware, a little piece of West Virginia in here, and then all of Washington, D.C. So there are a ton of people living in this area. That population is always growing. And a lot of people ask me, oh, how's the bay doing? Is it that I hear it's not good? And I say, that is true. We've been working at saving the bay for a really long time, and we haven't done it yet. However, the entire time that we've been working on that, development of the land and the human population in this area has increased. So despite that, and knowing all the pollution that comes with those actions, the water quality hasn't gotten worse in that time. So that's actually good news. So biggest thing I want to point out here as we're looking at this map with this huge Chesapeake Bay watershed, that's that blue border, is that we can see different types of land use on this map. Basically, green is forest. These brownish patches and like sort of patchworky areas that you can see are mostly agricultural lands. And then if we could zoom way in, we would see gray areas around Baltimore and around DC and Richmond. And those are the urban areas. So we're thinking about what's covering the land. Because how does water get into the Chesapeake Bay? It rains onto the land, it flows over the land, it soaks into the ground, and then it makes its way back out to the Chesapeake Bay. So if there's anything on the land that's not good for the water, it can wash into the water. So that's how pollution gets into the bay. And that's why I focus a lot on stormwater and a lot on what covers the land. So here we're looking at kind of the progression of the changes in land cover over time. And you can ignore all these little beavers here. It was part of a paper. This image comes from a paper that was discussing the change in population of beavers, which I've done some research on in the eastern part of the US. But so ignore the beavers, but we can see again, the green is representing forest cover. So this is all the way over here on the side, we're looking at pre-colonial times where there's a lot of forest, and this whole area, this watershed was about 95% forest. Over time, our forest cover has diminished. We've gotten a lot more agriculture, which is in kind of this wider area. And then we can see the red increasing. Here it's labeled as impervious cover or as urban land cover. So that just refers to roadways and rooftops and parking lots. So areas where when rains onto those surfaces, the water can't soak in. So we've lost a lot of trees and we've increased our impervious cover and our agricultural lands by quite a lot. So here we're looking at a comparison between sort of a natural land cover and an impervious land cover, and thinking about what happens to the water after it rains. So in a natural land cover is an estimation of about 10% of the water could run off. So run off over the land. And then we've got this infiltration. So where the water is soaking into the ground, about 50% of the water is soaking into the ground. Where we have a lot of impervious cover, a lot of development, we can see that most of the water actually runs off. A majority of it does, about 55%. And we only get about 15% of the water soaking into the ground. So that means that we have a much larger volume of water running off of the land, and it also happens much more quickly. And that provides a much greater opportunity for pollution to run off the land as well. So what's in the runoff? Pollution. What is pollution? It's a number of different things, right? So what we can see is the litter, the trash, but there could be fertilizers or pet waste or just dirt in that runoff. Heavy metals and contaminants, things that leak out of our cars. We've probably heard about other types of contaminants lately as well, like PCBs or PFAS. Forever chemicals have been in the news. And then when we have all this excess runoff, remember I said that it happens really quickly and there's a lot of it, it can cause erosion. So washing dirt into our rivers and streams, and it can also cause flooding. And with a changing climate that we're seeing, our weather patterns are changing and we're having really intense storms. And Baltimore especially, the region has seen a lot of a huge increase in flooding events. So all of that is talk about the Chesapeake Bay, the watershed, the land cover, and the water quality. So we know that there are problems there, but the good news is that we've been studying this a long time, And we've come up with a lot of different ways to improve the water quality. And some of those things we as individuals, as residents of where we live, of our communities, we don't have control over, right? So scientists figured out how to clean up sewage water a whole lot better. And that has made our water quality much, much better over time. But I, on a day-to-day basis, don't have control over that aside from flushing my toilet, right? So one thing that I do have control over is, you know, the little patch of ground that I take care of. That's my front yard or my backyard. And one thing I can do with that is a conservation landscape. So my definition of a conservation landscape involves deep-rooted native perennial plants. So these are plants that you only have to plant once. They come back every year. They typically get bigger every year too. And they keep roots in the ground all the time, all year. So that helps to reduce runoff because the roots are going to provide channels into the soil to help the water soak in. The plants are then going to soak up the water and use the water and prevent it from running off. And so as these plants are preventing runoff, they're reducing pollutant loads. They're reducing the chance of having standing water or flooding or erosion on your land because they're native plants, which I think Mary will probably have a good definition of native plants, but just kind of means that they're from this region, the simple way of putting it. They can support local wildlife and they can beautify your space. So here's a really simple example of someone converting their turf, their lawn grass into a conservation landscape. And then just a couple more examples. They can be small, they can be big, they can have flowers, they can not have flowers, but these plants are existing in the ground, they have roots in the ground all year round. And that's my definition of a conservation landscape. So I am going to stop sharing there. And I should have said it's totally fine to interrupt me with any questions. So before I pass it over to Mary, I just want to check in and see. I think we have time for like one or two. Any questions at this point?
I'll go first. You had me with the pervious pavements. I knew what that was, but you mentioned PFAS.
Oh, okay. Now
I've heard of it, but I don't recall.
see, I don't know what PFAS stands for. Mary, do you have the what it stands for? I will tell you, they're a group of chemicals that are referred to as forever chemicals. So they're not naturally occurring and they don't break down in the environment over time. So if they're in the water, they're always going to be in the water. They're really small molecules, and scientists have started doing research and finding that they could be harmful to human health. So recently, the Environmental Protection Agency has put a limit on a concentration of 6 types of PFAS that can be in our water, and our wastewater treatment plants are going to have to filter those contaminants out of the wastewater.
That's why I remember it. It's like contaminated particles. I actually just Googled it a little bit. Contaminated particles of waste in the water. And okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. So we've got an idea of the role that conservation landscaping and your garden kits can play in helping water quality. And I want to turn it over to Mary so that she can school us all on how to properly install and care for our new plants.
Great. Thanks, Claire. And thanks for that really wonderful overview of why we should even consider using native plants in conservation landscaping. Just real quick before I get started, I would like to know if anybody has heard of Blue Water Baltimore before. If you want to either do the hand raise symbol on the Zoom or raise your hand, Great, that's wonderful that many of you have heard of us. So I will share my screen and be pretty brief on the background of our organization, but there may be some programs that you're not familiar with. And make sure if everybody can see it. Good? Okay.
Looks good.
So again, I'm Mary Lewis with Herring Run Nursery. I'm the retail manager there. We have a staff of 3 full-time people at our nursery, and we have about 40 volunteers that help us on a regular basis. And the nursery, well, today, real quick, we'll go over Blue Water, Baltimore, who we are and what we do. The nursery specifically, native plants, your garden kits, what to do about deer when you have them in the area. I know you guys are pretty close to Leakin Park, so I know that there are deer around, and how to maintain these gardens over the long run. So Blue Water Baltimore, we're a water quality organization. We're part of the National Waterkeepers organization. And our mission is to restore the quality of Baltimore's rivers, streams, and harbor to foster a healthy environment, strong economy, and thriving communities. So Claire touched a lot on the uses of the Chesapeake Bay, and we work to protect that. We have 51 monitoring stations around the Jones Falls, Gwynns Falls, and Direct Harbor. We test those for several things, and all that data is available online for free at howsthewaterhen.org. But we also have, many other programs. So our 5 key programs are the Waterkeeper. We have a boat, and we also do stream monitoring. We have an advocacy team that works to support legislation that supports green stormwater infrastructure and just general environmental legislation. And we host rallies to speak up for clean water in strong communities. We have an eco-literacy team, which works on education programs for all ages. So we've gone into the Baltimore City school system and their summer camp program to teach about the urban water cycle and how that differs from how we learn about the water cycle in school. As Claire mentioned, all the impervious surfaces aren't typically in the imagery for how rain happens and how water gets to the bay. So we talk about the unique aspects of urban environments. We have a restoration team, which does green stormwater infrastructure, tree plantings, and tree giveaways. And we have our nursery, Herring Run Nursery, where we do grow and sell plants that are native to the Chesapeake Bay. Our Waterkeeper team also has a pollution reporting hotline. I'll leave this up for a second in case anybody wants to jot this down. So if you ever see pollution in the streams or something that doesn't look right in any waterway near you, you can call this number or report it online, and we will come out, investigate it, and take the necessary action to make sure it doesn't happen or that it gets cleaned up. And this actually is one of the most important things that we do, I think. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Fleischmann's vinegar suit. That company was openly polluting directly into the streams. And we found out from a concerned resident who saw fish dying in the stream near their house, and we took them to court, and we won. So that was a really wonderful thing that happened out of something bad. So native plants are what we carry at Herring Run Nursery. And to determine if it's native, we use the Chesapeake Bay watershed boundary to decide what we're going to carry. When you talk about native plants, you really have to think about how far out you're willing to go to decide if it's native. So some folks would like to stick to the county level. They want things that have been indigenous to this region from pre-colonial times, if you remember that graphic from Claire's presentation. We feel that the boundary should be much larger because if you think about bird migrations and just the climate in general and how things travel, even plants will travel on animal fur, the seeds will get stuck to their fur. So those animals can't read what we would call a political map or boundaries that are set by humans, but they can respond more to a larger natural boundary. So at Herring Run Nursery, we carry things native to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So they've been indigenous to this region from pre-colonial times. I will note that if you shop at other places for plants, you want to be sure that you know what they're calling a native plant, what boundary they're using. I know some places will say if it's native to the United States, it's native, but there are plants that are native to California and Arizona that are actually considered invasive here. And an invasive plant is one that upsets the natural balance of the ecosystem. It typically has no natural predators, and it takes over and it prevents native plants from being able to grow. Native plants matter for several reasons. I mentioned that they're indigenous to the region, so they've co-evolved with everything in the area, especially insects. And a lot of times we think we don't really want to attract bugs to our front yard, but from an ecological standpoint, those bugs are the basis of the food chain. So if you want birds and you want butterflies and you want all of the beautiful things, you also have to have the little guys. And those they need plants. They've co-evolved with these plants, and pollinators are, I'd say, probably the most popular bugs that we're attracting to our neighborhoods and our yards with native plants. And we need pollinators for our own survival, for the food that we eat. Native plants are also used in stormwater management. So if you've ever seen sort of a large parking lot with a basin full of plant material at the base of it, it's catching all that runoff from just that parking lot. The plants used in those are typically native plants, and they're adapted to the climate. So again, we use that larger boundary because our climate is changing. I'm not sure if anyone is aware, but our hardiness zones, so what is able to grow here, how cold and how hot a plant can handle, that is shifting north. And our hardiness zone has just changed. So by carrying things that are native to Northern Virginia, then as the climate changes, those plants may end up being more well adapted for this region. A couple examples of what we would also consider conservation landscaping, and maybe you've heard of these terms. This is a rain garden, similar to what I explained from catching bioretention, which is catching water from a parking lot. This is in Montford in East Baltimore, and this is a project that we designed and installed with the help of volunteers. And here it is planted. So a rain garden would be one type of conservation landscaping you could install. This is a meadow. This is our demonstration meadow at the nursery. And the idea behind a meadow is simply to eliminate lawn. Lawnmowers are not typically regulated and produce an immense amount of air pollution. And additionally, as Claire was talking about, impervious surfaces, roofs and cement and asphalt and the things that we kind of think of when we think of water not being able to penetrate it. Lawn is also really an impervious surface. It's typically really compacted, does not have deep roots. And when you're calculating areas for rain gardens and stormwater features, you count lawn typically as an impervious surface. So the more lawn we can eliminate, the better for the environment and for stormwater management. And meadows typically are about 70% grasses and 30% flowering plants. Here's a pollinator garden at the nursery. And so this would be the most similar to the type of garden your kits are. Pollinator gardens are designed to not only attract pollinators, but there's a couple of key principles. You want things that are blooming during different seasons. So you're providing nectar for the pollinators throughout the year. And you also want to plant things in larger groups, typically 5 to 7 plants of the same species. And that's because a lot of pollinators are specialists, meaning they're picky eaters, and they're only going to come to one specific plant. So if they're spending all of their energy to get to your garden and you only have one plant that maybe has 5 to 7 flowers on it, it's kind of wasted its energy to get there. Whereas if you have a larger crop of that one flower, then they can get all that they need and move on. And this is a woodland garden. This is actually in my yard. And so this is just to show that you don't need full sun. All the other gardens were full sun in order to have a native garden. And also sometimes when you have a really tricky site, having more of species that work in your space versus having a lot of variety is better. So I'll just briefly explain that. This is very shady and I have a lot of deer. So I've chosen maybe 5 to 7 species that have worked over time and just learned to love those because otherwise I'm just going crazy. So in order to choose the right plant for the right spot, you need to know a couple things about the space. Plants, I think, are like people where they have preferred environments. Some of us are introverts and we want to stay home and just read a book. And some of us want to go out and socialize. And some of us want a little bit of everything. So I think that when you think about sunlight and the soil, those are the 2 most important things. Some plants definitely prefer shade. Some plants like dry, some plants like wet. So you need to understand where they're going in order to choose the right plants for the space. You also need a water source. I have many people come out to the nursery wanting help designing a garden, typically for a school or a church or some sort of public space. And if there is no way to water the garden should not be installed. It does not need to be watered for a long time, but it needs to be watered at the beginning. So in order to set yourself up for success, you need to make sure you have a water source. And you also need to know if you have deer is a big one. Rabbits too, but I would say deer is probably more so something to consider. And the last thing I want to mention from this graphic is salt tolerance. In urban areas, so we have a lot of sidewalk strip plantings, or they're often called hell strips. And those plants need to be tolerant of salt in case that the roads are salted in the wintertime when we get snow or any winter weather. So a lot of plants cannot handle that, but some can. Any questions so far before I jump into your kits? Otherwise, we'll just keep rocking and rolling. Okay. So these are your layouts for the plants that you'll be receiving in your kits. And you will receive a copy of this with your kit as well. On the left, we have the sun kit, which was the most popular. I think we had 16 folks register for the sun kit on the left. And then on the right is the shade kit. I think we had about 4 people register for that. I'm going to go into detail about the plants that were chosen and the design principles behind these garden kits. But I will, yeah, we'll just get into it and I'll talk about spacing as we talk about each plant. So both kits include 1 shrub. That's just for some height and structural element through the whole season. They are not evergreen, they are deciduous. So they will drop their leaves in the wintertime, but the stems themselves will stay there. And the plant on the left is the sun shrub. This is called Ruby Spice Summer Sweet or Clethra alnifolia. And this will grow in full sun to part shade. It gets about 4 to 6 feet tall, and it has pink blooms in the summer. It is attractive to butterflies, hummingbirds, bumblebees. It's a great pollinator plant, and it has nice blooms in the summer. On the right, we have sweet spire, which the botanical name is Itea virginica. This grows pretty much anywhere, sun or shade. Gets about the same height and width. It's a little more rounded. It's not as upright as the summer sweet. And it blooms in the spring, and it also attracts a lot of butterflies. And while it is deciduous and will not have leaves in the wintertime, the stems are sort of red and green throughout the winter. So I think it still provides some interest through the wintertime. And then the sun perennials that were chosen for that first kit. First we have, I'll actually go out of order here. This one under the A, this is going to be the back of the garden. It's going to get the tallest and it blooms the latest. It is goldenrod. I will say that this plant has a bad rap for no reason at all. It does not cause severe fall allergies. It blooms at the same time as ragweed. So a lot of people are hesitant to plant this plant, and you should not be. This plant is insect pollinated, which means the pollen has to stick to the fur, fuzz, whatever you want to call it, of a bee. Ragweed, on the other hand, which is not here on the slide, is wind dispersed, wind pollinated. So the plants that cause a lot of those seasonal allergies, they don't need bugs to move their pollen because they just spray their pollen out into the air and depend on the wind. So I don't want anyone to feel that they should not plant goldenrod because it is a-okay to plant. And then in front of that, we will have the shrub that we just looked at. And this plant all the way on the left under the B, which is Baptisia or blue false indigo. This plant gets really bushy and it blooms in the spring. It's finished blooming now. The seed pods are really cool. They look like almost like a snap pea and they rattle in the wind. Then in front of that, we will have this yellow flowering coreopsis. And this is a long bloomer. It blooms typically 3 times. And you can also, if anyone's familiar with deadheading, after its first bloom, when the blooms start to fade, you can shear the old blooms off and that will sort of create the space for the next round of blooms to come. You do not have to do that. It's just an option. And then the front border plant is this purple flowering plant under the D. And this is dwarf Liatris or Liatris microcephala. It's just a dainty, cute little plant that's really wonderful for borders. And all of these plants are typically resistant of deer damage, but I'll get into that a little bit more later on in the presentation. And one other thing I wanted to mention before we get further is native plants typically have a relatively short bloom time. They're only going to bloom for 3 to 4 weeks typically. So that's why it's important to have something for the spring, something for the summer, and something for the fall for the pollinators. But also, as Miss Elaine mentioned, she plants her gardens for her to enjoy, and as everyone should. And you're going to want something that's, you know, that there's going to be blooms coming, or something has just finished, or something's currently in bloom. So we want you to enjoy these gardens as well. And a couple of folks asked about plants that can help sort of compete against invasive plants. And this goldenrod under the A, this is a great one for that. This will spread nicely, not too vigorously, but it'll form a dense mat at its base and help prevent invasive plants from spreading. Moving on to the shade, I have 2 slides for the shade plants. Along the backdrop plant is this one on the right. This is called sea oats. And it's a grass. It will spread by seed a little bit through the garden. So any bare spots through the garden, you might notice them popping up. You can leave them or you can pull them, whatever you prefer. It doesn't spread too aggressively. And then in front of that, we have white snakeroot. This is a picture looking down on the flower. This blooms late summer into fall and is a great pollinator plant, and butterflies, we see those on them. And in front of that, we have columbine, which is this under the E, this red flower. This is one of the first things that bloom that attracts hummingbirds, and it'll get about 2 feet tall. And this can also reseed in the garden. So all of these plants, you may notice as you learn about them, that you'll get some volunteers in the garden, which is what we want. We want the space to be full of plants over time. But if they're popping up where you don't want them, you can move them or remove them. And the last 2 plants in the shade garden, this is a nodding onion, which is a native allium. This will be sort of front and center in a little clump. And then the front border plant is Christmas fern, which is an evergreen fern. And that's all for the shade garden. Any questions about the plants that are in your kits? Okay. I'm not going to read this word for word. I just want you to recognize it because you will also be getting this document with your layout for your garden kit. It's our planting and watering instructions. The things I'll touch on are that when you plant, your perennials are mostly in quart pots, which is about a 4.5-inch wide pot. The hole that you dig for those plants should be twice as wide and just as deep as the pot. So you don't have to dig a really deep hole. It's more of a shallow, wide hole. And with your kit, you will also be getting a bag of compost called Leaf Grow. And you'll just throw a little handful in each hole that you dig. and sort of churn it in. And when you fill, you'll dig the hole, you'll put the plant in, and when you backfill, when you put the dirt back into the hole, you don't want to cover the root ball, which is whatever came in that pot. So basically you don't want to bury the whole plant. You just want it to be sitting slightly above ground level. So if this is the ground and you have the hole here, then your plant will be a little bit above, and then you'll just fill the soil back up to the edge of the plant. You're not going to cover that soil because the roots have to breathe. And the same goes for mulch. You'll get bags of mulch with your kit. And when you're mulching the space, you don't want that mulch up against the stem of the plant. That'll cause the plant to rot. And for the shrubs, it's an invitation for borers. So you want to make sure you leave a couple inches around each plant of where there is no mulch. It's just sort of the dirt that you saw when it came out of the pot. And watering, when you plant these plants, you want to give it a really good soaking as soon as it's planted. And then about once or twice a week, you'll water it through this summer. Don't count on rain unless we get an inch or more. So if it's a quick afternoon storm where it's just like a quick downpour and then nothing else, don't count that as a watering. It didn't really have a chance to soak in. But then once we get through the summer and into the fall, you should not have to water. Next summer, you may need to water just if we have really dry spells, and they'll tell you these plants will definitely start wilting if they need water. But in general, once to twice a week through the first summer, then you shouldn't have to worry about it. You can mulch every spring. We'll get into that actually when we talk about maintenance. So here is a picture from my neighborhood of the deer that we live with. Many plants are listed as deer resistant or deer tolerant, and I would never believe it. Certainly they have a better chance of not being eaten, but the baby deer will eat everything, whether or not it's poisonous to them. So as you're establishing young plants, it's important to protect them if you have deer in your area. And there's many different ways that you can do that. You can use deer repellents. There's granulars and there's sprays. There are motion censored sprinklers, which in urban spaces doesn't always work because it's going to spray anybody who's walking by. And there's netting. And then I've also seen folks get these like mesh wire sort of trash bins from the dollar store and just put those upside down on top of the plants, just as a physical barrier to protect them until they can get a little bit established. So next year, once your plants have come back, and as Claire mentioned, as they get bigger and fill more space, if they nibble here and there in your plant material, it's okay. It's not going to kill the plant. But when they're small and just getting established and they nibble a little bit, it's going to cause more harm to the plant material. Another method that I've seen lately is bamboo stakes. So if you know, just like the garden stakes that you can use for tomatoes and that kind of thing, you can just stick those sort of randomly through the garden, and the deer don't like to bump into things that they can't see, and they don't have very good eyesight. So that's something else you can consider. So if you notice something eating your plants, don't wait too long and find something to keep them off of your plants while they get established. As I mentioned, you're going to water weekly, maybe even twice a week if it's really hot and dry through the first summer. Weed out unwanted plants monthly. If you mulch your garden, you should not even have to weed every month. It will probably be every 2 months. But learning to identify the plants that are in this garden kit, so as they come up from seed next year, then you can identify whether you want to pull it or not. And we do recommend mulching in spring until the garden fills out completely, and that's to help with moisture retention and also to keep the weeds down. These are just some resources if you're interested in learning more about native plants. I also, if you want to come out to the nursery anytime after you get your kit, after it's installed, if you're having any questions, you can always reach out to us. Our nursery is open to the public Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 9 to 4. And we have lots more plants to look at as well. This is where we are located. We're on the back of the Mount Pleasant Golf Course on Hillen Road between Northern Parkway and Lock Raven Boulevard. It's definitely a unique space for an environmental nonprofit to be located on a golf course, but we're working with what we've got. And that's all I have. I went through it pretty quick.
I think it was perfect timing. We've got 5 minutes to spare. So Mary, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And especially the tips on how to plant successfully. That watering schedule, I think, will be really helpful. And of course, mulching. I was thinking about, a lot of these plants might be new to folks. So when they're coming back up next year, being able to recognize them is important. And it's something that I've been trying to figure out as well for myself. I've been establishing a lot of new plants in my front yard. And I went out early this morning and I started taking pictures because some of them are starting to kind of lose their leaves or lose their blooms for the year. And so I'm like taking pictures so I can draw where they are and so that I remember for next year. So that's something that I think will be to keep in mind, but also you're going to receive all the information about the plants in this presentation, as well as photos of the plants so that you can keep learning over the next year or so as they become established.
I just want to mention one other thing that you reminded me of as far as the maintenance goes, and that is the perennials, which come back every year, not the shrub, but the perennials. They will die back in the wintertime, but the stems will stay there. And some folks will cut those back because they don't want sort of dead stems throughout the yard. From a wildlife gardening perspective, it's best to leave the stems. Birds can use them for nesting material and eat the seeds. Some pollinators will lay their eggs in those stems. But also, as you mentioned, in sort of remembering where things are, I like to leave them so that I remember that I planted that plant. Just, as sort of a sign. And even if you didn't like the whole plant, if it's flopped over, even if you just left like 6 to 8 inches of that stem there through the winter, then come spring, you see something coming up in that spot, but you know that it was there last year and you did not weed it last year. So that's just another thing you can do to make sure you don't pull out the good plants.
Really good points.
I have a question really quick. It would be faster for me in the process, and I'm just kind of figuring it out how and what I'm gonna do. What are your thoughts on kind of a collage of pots, putting them together? Are you following me? Just kind
So
of
instead of
setting
putting
it up so.
So instead of putting the plants directly in the ground, having them in pots. So really good point. Something that Mary and I talked about a lot. She was like, "Well, we want to make container garden kits." And I was like, "No, they have to be in the ground because of water quality."
Right.
So, Jaquesta, you can do with your plants whatever you like. However, from a water quality perspective, there will be more benefit if they are directly in the ground. The other thing I will say about planting in pot, and actually Mary, you might have more points on this than me, but the other thing I'll say about planting in pots versus planting directly into the ground is that the ground has more water storage in it all the time versus a pot. So I have always been more successful having perennials grow in the ground because they've got more water to pull from, and I don't have to remember to water them all the time. But you're right, as far as installation goes, it is a little easier to stick it in a pot. Mary,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll say that all of these species are fine in containers. They would all grow well in a container. And you definitely will have to water forever, not just this first summer while it's getting established. You will have to continue to water. The other thing I will mention, well, actually two things, is if you add a little bit of compost to your potting soil that you plant in a container, that will also help store some water and also provide nutrients for the perennials since they come back every year, whereas annuals, they just need it for that season and then that's it. And then you may add a little bit more potting soil each year. And then the other thing is that we don't warranty any plants that are planted in containers because of the watering issue. And the life expectancy is shorter. So if these plants are in the container for 5 to 7 years or so, and their roots take up all of that space in the pot, if it has a hard freeze in the wintertime, that's going to be detrimental to the health of the plant. So we tell people you'll get more life out of it than an annual, but you won't get as long of a life as if it were planted in the ground. So some folks we'll plant them in a container for 3 to 5 years or so, and then maybe dig them out and divide them, or dig them out and plant them in the ground when they're ready for those plants.
Okay.
Renata,
Okay.
did you have a question?
Yeah, I had 2 questions that came up when I was thinking about this. Number one, tips for planting on slopes, anything that we should especially consider when we're planning on the, okay, that's good. Just give me a second. Anything we should consider when we're planning on slopes when we're putting these in, or do you not recommend them for slopes? There's a lot of hills and stuff in the neighborhood. That's why I wanted to check. And then also I'm seeing a lot of spotted lanternfly nymphs, the like little black bugs with the white dots. I'm sure that means there's going to be a bunch of them full grown in the summer. Do you anticipate any problems with the lanternflies in these kits? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So first for planting on slopes, all of these plants can be planted on slopes. If it is a very significant slope, maybe you want to adjust the layout a bit. But no, as long as it's just, not like a full 45-degree angle, then they'll be fine. One thing with planting on slopes, if you're mulching after a hard rain, you want to go out and just double check that that mulch hasn't washed down onto your plant material. As I mentioned, you want to keep that mulch away from the stem. So sometimes you just have to go out there and just make sure that you push the mulch back away from the plant material. As far as spotted lanternfly, thankfully, they do not really impact native plants. It's mostly, well, there's a native grape that they are impacting. But no, there's not a huge concern. There's at this point nothing really we can do about it. They're here to stay, but be grateful that you do not grow grapes for wine for a living, because those folks are having a lot more trouble with it. We have them at the nursery. They don't impact our plants. The cicadas may come, and we have experienced damage to plant material from cicadas, but it's not so much that it's killing the plant material. They typically just have some tip dieback, and that's okay. So great questions. Alicia, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I already have some weed barrier laid down under some mulch, and I want to know if it's safe to plant there since it's already on the ground.
Yes. Yep. You can plant there. Especially for the shrub, you're going to want to cut a hole in the weed barrier, probably 2 to 3 feet wide circle, just to allow it some space to grow wider. These shrubs that we have do sucker, not extensively, but the way that they get wider is they send up more stems from the root zone. And yeah, just anywhere that you're planting, just cut a hole. You can even just cut an X in the weed barrier for the smaller perennials. Typically, we don't recommend weed barrier just because it will be more difficult for the plants to spread and fill in the space. But if it's already there, just work with what you got and plants will be fine.
And they are, with the perennials, is it okay to plant them near the hostas? If we already have hostas planted? Okay.
Yep. It is okay to plant them by the hostas. The one plant, did you get a sun kit, do you remember, or a shade kit? Do you have more
I
sun
don't
or more shade?
remember. I think
Okay.
I may have ordered the sun kit.
Okay. The only plant, if you want to just make a note that I would plant further away from the hostas, is the goldenrod, that yellow flower that blooms in the fall, just because they spread a bit more and may end up sort of competing with your hostas more than the other perennials. So by
Right.
giving them more space, I'm just thinking maybe 3 feet from the hostas would be good space to give them.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Mary, I have a question. So if you have stones down and you have mulch over top of that, does all of that have to be removed before you dig a hole? Or would you recommend planting anything in that area?
What type of stones are we talking about? Like pebbles
So
or
it's like
larger?
so it's some pebbles and then some that are a little bit larger than a pebble. So they're not
Mm,
huge rocks. So would you
mm-hmm.
say not to plant anything in that area, or what would you recommend?
Was
Well, I
that,
think
Angela, were those stones used as like a mulch in the past in a garden, or are they just like stones that are in your
So technically it was used as a Zen garden.
got it.
And
Okay.
then the stones started to fade away a little bit, and then I put mulch over top of it, but I want to remove the mulch altogether, and put some of the flowers there. So I just wanted to know, once I remove all the mulch, and can I then, with those stones, is it a rake away, or are they gonna go down in the ground, or
yeah, I
what?
think it depends how deep it is. If it's just a couple inches, I would say removing as much as you can in the space that you're planting. So maybe a foot diameter circle where you're planting. It is inevitable that it will mix into the soil, and that's okay as long as it's
Mhm.
not like 75% rock and 25% soil.
Oh yeah, it's not that deep. Yeah, it's not that deep.
Yeah, it should be fine. And the plants that were chosen for these kits are they're very hardy. One thing you could consider is if you remove the mulch and you notice you have a lot of stone, kind of pushing it towards the edges of the space to act as
Mhm.
like an edging, sort of, just
Okay,
to be kind of decorative. But if it's just a little bit mixing in the soil, that is totally fine.
okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, so it's 7:38. I just wanted to be respectful of everyone's time. Mary, if there's one more question out there, do you have time to take it?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have a question for Mary? Miss Elaine, it looks like, yep, we'll let you unmute yourself. There it is.
Okay, that's what I have problems with muting and unmuting. But anyway, I planted a couple of rows of Sharons, and I put one on each end of my garden. And I noticed that, and it's on a hill, like a little slope. And when I first planted them, they were standing up. Now they are leaning toward the front, and they are expanding. I mean, I'm getting little ones popping up all over the place. I really don't mind that too much, because then it will help the ground, I do believe, once their roots get embedded, because in that area where the hill that I decided to plant them on has started erosion from water coming down, and it was starting to wash it away. So I'm thinking, with them in there like that, would that prevent some of the wash away?
It should and it could. Rose of Sharon are not native. They are somewhat invasive, and their root structure is not as significant as some other plants. One plant that you could consider adding to that space to help with the stormwater runoff is called soft brush or juncus. And that plant is really, and a lot of grasses as well. Switchgrass is a great one. Those plants have super deep and super rigorous root systems. that may help prevent erosion just a little bit more than the Rose of Sharon.
Okay.
But yeah, any plant there is going to be better than no plant.
Yeah, because I planted some lilies, and everything that I planted there it almost looks like a young jungle. So I need to know how I can maintain it to really make it look nice. It doesn't look bad, but it's getting to be like overgrown.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
I will.
Saturday, I'll be able to show you all. You
Yeah.
can
Yeah,
see what I have.
I will also say that if you wanted to prevent the Rose of Sharon from spreading over time, cutting the flowers off before they go to seed. So that one definitely spreads by seed. So you can leave the flowers on, but once they start to fade, if you trim those off, that'll help prevent it from spreading by seed more.
Okay.
and Miss Elaine, I'll be there on Saturday. Mary actually won't be there on Saturday. I will be. And part of my job actually as watershed restoration specialist is to assist residents with erosion issues or standing water issues on your property. So I can make some recommendations, but glad to have those plant species in our back pockets
Okay.
to keep in mind for your space.
Okay. Thank you.
So I will follow up this meeting, this presentation with an email with the recording, and Mary, should we share your contact information or the contact information
Sure.
for the nursery as well? So if you have any other questions that come up, you can reach out directly to Mary. You can always reach out to me as well. And the garden designs that Mary put together, as well as the care and maintenance, you'll be getting printouts of those along with your kits. And we look forward to seeing you on Saturday to pick up all of your plants. And I can't wait to see pictures after everything's installed. So thanks so much for being here tonight. And Mary, thank you for taking the time to share with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for
Thank
having me.
you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you, everybody.